Why, thank you so much, Mike. So welcome to High Torque Delivery with Ionic. My name is Lukas Ruebbelke. I am the VP of Developer Growth at Ruebbelke Software. And this basically means that I found a way to convert really my love of learning into just a full-time profession. And so I spend the majority of my time mentoring developers and working to educate clients. As an Ionic partner, we have spent a significant amount of time over the last few quarters helping clients implement Ionic solutions in high torque engagements. And so the question is, what do you mean, or what do I mean when I say high torque delivery? Well, for the sake of this presentation, I am referring to situations where a client needs to deliver a product to market quicker than traditional means would allow. And so this current pandemic has created an incredibly unique window of opportunity for the right kind of companies to capitalize on. While larger, more traditional companies, they're just trying to figure out if they should get out of bed in the morning. And because success and excellence are primarily dependent on behavior and systems, our talk today is going to be two-part strategy and two-part tactical. So I spent a lot of time working on expressing these concepts in a way that can be generally applied to any area of your development, which in hindsight is kind of amusing and kind of ironic to me. So the first concept we have to talk about when we talk about high torque delivery is feedback loops. Feedback loops are everywhere, and I believe that they are the atomic building block of any successful endeavor. And the reason being is that feedback loops hinge on a single yet critical question. And that is, how do we know anything? More importantly, how do we know that we are building the right thing? So the first key to high torque delivery is getting it right the first time. And so this is a classic feedback loop. We build something, we measure the results, we learn from it, and then we build some more. And this right here is a classic agile board, which is a form of a feedback loop. With every sprint cycle, stakeholders have the opportunity to tell us that we're either awesome or we need to go back to the drawing board. And this is the most classic love story of all. And if you do not know what this feedback loop is, you will, and you will learn to love it. And so this leads to another critical question. How do feedback loops accelerate delivery? Here's a quote from one of the godfathers of programming, Kent Block. And he said, make it work, make it right, make it fast. And this developer came along, entirely derivative in everything that he does, and he amended this just a bit. And it goes like this: make it work, make it known, make it right, make it fast. Our ability to know if we're on the right track is an incredible competitive advantage. And this comes down to our ability to answer this question: how fast can we put what we are building in the customer's hands? And so I had the privilege of working with an incubator in San Francisco that was heavily influenced by a gentleman of the name Tom Chi. So Tom, he's famous for his work at Google X, and more specifically, Google Glasses. And Tom was off the chart for his ability to rapidly prototype a product and get feedback. He could accomplish in an afternoon what would take Fortune 100 companies months to achieve the same results. And one of my favorite techniques that he would use was called home team, away team. And how this worked is basically two of my friends would go to the mall, and one of my friends would sit in the food court. He was the home team. My other friend would walk around the mall and solicit feedback from whatever application that they were working on at the time. Just guerrilla style, just say, hey, can you give me some feedback? What do you think? As soon as a participant provided feedback, away team would call home team and tell him to implement the changes and push a new build out. Within minutes, there was a new build and home team was ready for more feedback. And so the reason why I bring this up is that this kind of accelerated iterative process is only possible with, first, the right mindset, but you also have to have the right tooling and the right platform to develop on when you're looking for this kind of acceleration. And so what this allows is for customers to tell us if we're building the right thing instead of us having to guess. And so these interactions with these customers, it falls into the initial phases of the software development lifecycle. And so this is a slightly condensed version of the software development lifecycle, or SDLC, as it pertains to developers. Now, what I want to emphasize here is there's an incredible amount of ambiguity at the onset of a new project. And as we progress through the SDLC from design to maintenance, that ambiguity is replaced with certainty. And so this creates what I call the testing spectrum. And when there's high ambiguity in a project, we resort to high-touch modalities to ensure correctness. This is usually in the form of user testing and asking a lot of questions. So inspection is the most effective and appropriate method at this stage. But once we've established what we are building, then we shift our efforts into low touch or automated modalities. And so this transition from high touch to machine touch is possible when we embrace the second concept that I want to discuss. Our ability to effectively implement feedback loops is directly proportional to the quality of our abstractions. This particular image is profoundly applicable as we start to discuss abstractions in managing complexity. The reason why this pit crew is so efficient is because they have the ability to work completely independent of each other while accomplishing a single cohesive goal. And when we talk about abstraction, the term can cover a large number of things, and we could easily go down this academic rabbit hole. And as tempting as that may be, I'm simply going to refer to abstractions as the act of managing or arranging complexity within an application. So how this works is we identify levels of complexity, and then we suppress those details to the lowest possible level in which they can still be effective. And so when I started developing applications, my mental model basically looked like this. It was a single layer with a small set of coarse-grained components, coarse-grained and very large components. And if we're honest with ourselves, this is how everybody thought about web applications when modern frameworks were emerging. So, show of hands, if you've ever built one very, very large AngularJS controller with one very, very large template, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The reality is that a well-architected application presents natural abstraction layers that look like this. Now, what's interesting to point out is that the top layer is very specific to a certain set of use cases. But as we move down the layers, we start to become more and more general in the application of our code. For instance, a component layer or a component library such as Angular Material can be used in any Angular application. An even better example is a general utility library like Moment that can really just be used in anything. And so when we fail to properly manage complexity, we end up with coupling, which means we essentially have more than one element unnecessarily intertwined with another element or elements. But when we get this layer or levels of abstraction correct, what we end up with is cohesion. We achieve a high level of cohesion. And so this means you have a number of independent elements logically grouped together to serve a common purpose. And so again, think of the pit crew that we saw the picture of. And so to illustrate this, let's look at the natural progression of modern web applications. Before we had modern frameworks, well, we had jQuery, air quotes, applications. Our imperative logic and our declarative markup were completely intertwined, which made it impossible to establish any sense of architecture. Well, fortunately, AngularJS came along, and it gave us a really clean way to separate our imperative logic and our declarative markup. This quickly led to what became one of the top Stack Overflow questions for AngularJS for many years. And the question was, what happens when two controllers need to share common state or common functionality? Well, the answer is to move that functionality into a new abstraction layer, which in this case was a service. And so this was fairly effective, but there was always something that bothered me about how we implemented typical services. And that was a typical service was typically stateful in that it was responsible for managing server-side communication and application state at the same time. The fact that we were breaking the single responsibility principle never quite felt right to me. Well, fortunately, state management patterns like Redux emerged, and this allowed us to separate application state from the business logic that governed it. So let's shift the time-space continuum, and let's look at this on a spectrum. You'll notice that on the left, our prehistoric attempts at web applications were tightly coupled and very specific. As we started to progress to the right, our applications began to move complexity into more general abstraction layers, which reduced coupling and increased cohesion. And so just to foreshadow a bit, we're going to revisit this narrative arc again. As I realized as I was putting this presentation together, it really affects us on more levels than I originally realized. So just a bit of foreshadowing, but for now, good abstractions allow us to write high quality code once and use it over and over and over. And so the ability to reuse code obviously saves us and our clients a ton of time and money, but it also dramatically reduces the surface area that we need to test because we are consolidating our moving pieces into single places. And so essentially, specific details become reusable general details. With feedback loops and abstractions now in the forefront of our mind, let's endeavor to apply these concepts in some practical, tactical use cases here. So tooling is where I believe that front-end developers have seen really the greatest advancements in their ability to quickly accomplish meaningful work. Things that established classical languages have enjoyed and taken for granted for many years are still just a little magical for JavaScript developers. I'm still very much impressed when IntelliSense and auto imports just work. I know this because when they stop working, it's really annoying. And so abstractions, they really affect tooling in a really meaningful way. And I want to prove this with a single question. Sit back, grab some popcorn, and let the drama unfold. Does anybody remember when Ionic and Angular were in a mutually exclusive relationship? Me too. And there's a little tear there. I love Ionic, but Ionic 3 broke my heart because Angular and Ionic were tightly coupled together, and it was really, really hard to keep one in sync with the other, especially with the level of discovery and ambiguity that existed in the early stages of Angular. And so this is why I have massive, massive respect for Max Lynch and the Ionic team for making what I believe was an incredibly wise and savvy decision. And that was really to decouple Ionic from Angular, which opened up the door for additional frameworks to leverage all of the work that had been done up to this point. So what might have seemed like a step backwards at the time was really, in my opinion, a quantum leap forward. And so let's anchor this discussion of abstractions versus complexity in some concrete examples. When we want to generate a service in Ionic, we just have to run this command. It's a fairly simple command that's doing something under the hood on our behalf. Well, the complexity is that the Ionic CLI is delegating this work to the Angular CLI. So Ionic focuses on Ionic and lets Angular manage its own complexities. And so this is where the real work is being done. And so this almost feels like a little bit like Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, that they're out painting fences and taking all the credit for a job well done. If you get that reference, you get a high five. But the fact that you are basically saying, Ionic, do this thing, and then Ionic saying, hey, Angular, why don't you go ahead and actually do this for me? And here's an even more complex example. So what happens when I run this command? Well, a lot of things, apparently. And because I'm curious and because I can read, I was able to parse out most of the high-level commands that this is actually abstracting over. So it looks like 8 or 10. So that little piece of programmatic poetry is actually running a number of commands on our behalf. Do we actually need to know what they are and what they do? Quite simply, no. Complexity has been pushed down to a place where we do not care about. We don't have to. So here is another example. The Ionic framework has some really, really, really good set of components. It's almost ridiculous how well that these components look and work. The complexity that exists to make these kind of components work as well as they do has completely been absorbed by the Ionic team. So how does the date picker work? Well, one word: who cares? It just works. And I, as a consumer, am completely content existing on top of the extraction layer. There's no reason for me to step into the upside down to figure out what's happening under the hood. And you may not know this, but Ionic can actually target multiple build platforms such as iOS and Android. Stunning. But the beauty of this arrangement is that we can navigate all of this with a few very polished commands that have abstracted out an incredible amount of complexity away from our line of sight, and so we can focus on just delivering high quality software. And speaking of complexity, has anyone ever submitted an application to the App Store? So I don't care how good you are. I don't care how experienced you are. Submitting to the App Store is a complex, time-consuming process. Well, here is a sweet abstraction for you. Ionic App Flow. And the only thing that I need to say about this is one click app submissions, case closed, moving on. There we go. So now we're in our final lap of how Breebug uses Ionic for high torque delivery. Now, here's a universal law of success. No one succeeds in a vacuum. We can have a philosophical discussion later about some random outlier, but let's be honest, we're all here because of the collective efforts of a lot of people ahead of us. And I love the development community because it is one of the most generous groups I've ever met in my life. And so now let's go back to the graph that we saw earlier. This is application centric, but we can extend this general spectrum to encompass an entire technology stack. And it looks like this here. We have templates, which then we build components, which then we build services. But from there, once you start to get into large scale applications and enterprise development, now you need to start thinking about developing more than one application, plural, and also multi-platform development. And we are successful at Breebug because of the amazing work done by some of our favorite community partners. And most of you are familiar with this tooling. So Narwhal Extensions allows us to develop multiple applications within a single repository. This gives us an even richer model for managing complexity, not only across multiple applications, but multiple frameworks. And then built on top of NX is a tool called XSplat, which is short for cross-platform, which was created by Nathan Walker, which allows us to not only target multiple projects, but multiple projects across multiple platforms. And so this is what this would look like using NX extensions or Narwhal Workspace with XSplat. Now, what you'll notice here is that you have a number of frameworks and platforms that you can target right out of the gate. And this combination of tooling has given us an incredible amount of torque as we help clients bring their products to market across a number of different contexts. It changes every single time, but having these options that we can target right out of the gates from this tooling has been absolutely huge. And so in conclusion, I want to say one more thing. Speaking of complexity, has anyone ever tried to integrate with a native SDK? So having spent some time working on a native SDK integration, this picture is hilarious to me. Native SDK integration is wildly inconsistent, and if you're lucky, it's nothing more than extreme tedium. And I just happened to win the developer lottery at this point, and I have the privilege of giving you a hint of things to come. What if I told you that nativescript/Ionic existed? So this is probably not what you think it is, and it certainly is not what I thought it was. So NativeScript and Ionic have had this rather unfortunate and persistent us versus them narrative that really has been perpetuated by commercial interest. And so remember, this falls on the wrong end of our specific versus general spectrum. Well, I believe this narrative is going to change because there's been some changing of the guard, and Nathan Walker and his business partners have acquired NativeScript, and they place a high premium on cohesion over coupling. And so what this has allowed us to do at Breebug was to do a native integration with about this level of complexity. Import native from NativeScript Ionic, and boom, done. And then we just use native to access the native SDK. Now notice we're calling the native SDK using a language that we're already familiar with, JavaScript. And so it was a bit of a brain bender for me at first, but the ability to manage all of the native code from a TypeScript code base is huge. This essentially provides a TypeScript abstraction around native complexity. Just to elaborate a bit further, remember when I said that the SDK integration is wildly inconsistent? Well, notice here that we're actually integrating two SDKs. There's one for iOS, and then there's one for Android. Notice the completely inconsistent naming conventions? Welcome to the club, my friend. We were able to use this in production. It's been fantastic. So when can everyone else use this? Well, given the recent handoff, Nathan has a few remaining items on the roadmap, specifically around debugging, logging, and distribution. But if you go to this URL, you can sign up to be a part of the beta release, which I can say is being part of the alpha release. It's really exciting technology. And so I want to wrap this up with one final thought. Ruebbelke is able to achieve high torque delivery because we're able to leverage some really powerful tooling that allows us to achieve a high level of velocity at the most general layer, so that the majority of our time is spent dialing in the specifics and mixing to taste. Tooling like Ionic, NativeScript, and NX allows us to provide incredible value to customers because they exist on the right side of the spectrum. And more importantly, and this is quite possibly my favorite slide in the entire presentation, these tools exist because of people like Max Lynch, Nathan Walker, Jeff Cross, Victor Savkin. And so I just want to take a moment to applaud Max for having the courage to decouple Ionic from a single framework so that it's more generally available. I want to applaud Jeff and Victor for building tooling that allows us to not be coupled to a single project using a single framework. And I especially want to applaud Nathan for his generosity and his commitment to the community and his work to eliminate one more unnecessary us versus them false narrative that does not benefit a single developer. And I'm honored to call each of these individuals my friend, but I'm not exclusively special by any definition whatsoever, because if you've met Max, Jeff, Victor, or Nathan, you really know that they're truly a friend to everyone. And we exist in an opportunity-rich environment because we have individuals who value cohesion over their own specific goals. And to that, I just offer my most sincere thanks. And on behalf of Ruebbelke and myself, I just want to thank you for your time, for sharing the last 30 minutes with me. And as a friend, if you have any questions about what I said or would like to talk about how you and your team can realistically apply these principles to your own work, please reach out to me on Twitter or even on the Ruebbelke website. And on that, cheers and thank you so much.